So, firstly, apologies for the juicy and loaded title, but I assure you it's not clickbait, as I'll momentarily explain. So, I'm not actually sure this argument has been made before. I think in other forms, obviously, it has. Omnipotence paradoxes have been put forward before concerning God, such as the unliftable rock, which I'll get to in a bit. However, before we go into all that, I need to be precise in what I'm arguing against. So the God I'm focusing on here is the one the majority of monotheists alive believe in, including Christians, Muslims, Jews, etc. Or at least a God with very commonly held traits. So these traits are omniscience, that is all-knowing, omnipresent, that is being everywhere, omnipotent, that is being all-powerful, important for our purposes here, omnibenevolent, which is all good, again another trait that has its own problems and we'll focus on in a different video I expect, transcendent, which is wholly removed from and independent of the universe, which like omnibenevolence and most of these traits has its own problems, which I actually focus on in a separate video, which I'll link in the description and at points in this video too. And then finally, immanence, just to arbitrarily knock it off at some point, which is wholly within the universe. God is wholly within the universe. Now, some among you may already see glaring contradictions in just these 6 traits, and notably the last 2, as they seem to be mutually exclusive. And as I've said, I have a separate video on the proof of God's non-existence based on this contradiction, and indeed based on the generally accepted trait of transcendence. However, today we're going to focus exclusively on the omnipotence trait. So any self-respecting God is going to be omnipotent, isn't it? So that is all powerful. And it's important for us here to stress exactly what this really means. So God created the universe via this trait, defined specifically by Merriam-Webster as, quote, one who has unlimited power or authority, end quote. So unlimited means exactly that. So I think you know where I'm going with this. The most famous omnipotence paradox is the rock paradox. Can God create a rock so heavy that it cannot lift it? If it can, then there's something beyond its power, because it can't lift it. If it cannot create it, then there again is something beyond its power, and by definition, God can't be omnipotent, as there is a limit to its power. It's not unlimited in its power. It can either be one thing or the other. It can't be both. It doesn't work like that. So rock creation is also not some illogical and impossible concept either. It's unlike square circles, for example. Religious texts and traditions inform us quite reliably that gods create rocks all the bloody time, and even whole planets and a universe in mere days. So another key characteristic of the Abrahamic God is its eternal nature. So time as well wouldn't be much of a problem. It has all the time it needs to create its unliftable rock. Another take on this kind of paradox, which considers God's eternal nature too, is this. So can an omnipotent and eternal God kill itself? And this isn't just, I'm not just posing this question to shock or to get some attention. I'm genuinely interested in the answer to this question because it has profound consequences, doesn't it? If we can come up with these different arguments that a priori show that God doesn't exist, it'll have a profound effect, probably a better effect on the world, and we can sort of move on from there. This is even more reasonable to ask when we think about it. I mean, I'll use the word kill to mean not exist in this context, just to be clear. So God exists according to theists, with that at least partly meaning that God is immanent, that is wholly within and interacting with the universe. To exist then is to be something, and logically anything can become nothing. Logically, can't it? If you're a thing, then there's the obverse of that state is to become nothing. I, for example, exist in space and time. So Adam was born, I have mass, height, dimension, I exist in time, I can affect and I am affected by my environment. I exist in this way, as do rocks, trees, planets, stars, galaxies and everything else. Yet these things are contingent. Indeed, all things are contingent. I could have not existed. So every man, rock, tree, planet, and star can not exist, at least in its current form. And science and common sense tells us that all these things at some point won't exist. God too exists then, and presumably, barring special pleading over some magical nature of the thing, God logically cannot exist too. So like the rock of the previous paradox, this category of thing is not logically impossible. We're not exactly asking God to create a square circle or a simultaneously pregnant yet not pregnant woman, which these things don't make sense and therefore aren't material in the actual world. So if indeed God is omnipotent, having no limit to its power, can it destroy itself? Can God cause its own non-existence? Well, playing devil's advocate, one way out of this is to dodge the question itself. So it could be argued that I'm ignoring God's other traits, such as its eternal nature. Since God is a necessary thing, it by definition cannot not have existed. It's very similar to my own argument, which I'll link here, and in the description about the universe's necessity, which is far more likely in my opinion, but that's by the by. So its potential non-existence makes no sense by virtue of the thing itself. That's what you could argue, that the question itself is invalid. In a bizarre turn of events then, even accepting the aforementioned explanation, that there's still something, broadly speaking, that you and I can do, which God can't. Which is a bit weird, isn't it? God, by virtue of being God, cannot not exist, whereas you and I are perfectly capable of non-existence. It happens all the time. Indeed, this is inevitable. Barring specific beliefs about immutable natures and afterlives, which are hardly universal, by the way. There are some religions that just believe in an oblivion for bad people or whatever, people that don't believe there's an oblivion, there's not necessarily an afterlife for everyone. It's true in a sense that us fragile and mortal humans then can do something that's beyond God. Indeed, this has other fascinating implications too. So in Isaac Asimov's short story, The Last Answer, so please pause here by the way and click the link above, or in the description to avoid spoilers. So in The Last Answer, God is loosely represented by a character simply known as the Voice. The protagonist, a man called Murray, who has been robbed of this potential oblivion and rendered immortal, mulls over the horrific implications of his new infinite destiny. So he's never going to end, he's just going to exist eternally. Imagine that. Might have to do a video really thinking about that and just to mull it over so that these people who look forward to eternal life and all that can really consider what that actually means. But anyway, the Voice itself in the story admits that it's existed eternally and has similarly attached other minds, like Murray's, like the man's, to it in eternal thought. So now, after thinking it over, Murray, the guy, finds this prospect of endlessness intolerable and declares his intention of ending his own existence. Why not? I wouldn't want to bloody live forever either. I'd probably feel the same way. But the Voice rejects this, saying it will simply bring him back as many times as needed. It just undo it every time. Won't let him be. The Voice, it turns out, cannot do that one thing, and this one thing is what it longs for above all other outcomes. So it just wants to end its own existence, to be freed of eternal consciousness. To this end, it has restrained quadrillions of other minds throughout the whole universe to it in eternal thought to help in bringing about this final end, to indeed find the last answer. So this story is great. I also recommend The Last Question by the same author. They're just very thought-provoking, and they've always stuck with me. So one thing Murray points out in this story is that God, the Voice, cannot know everything. That is, it's not omniscient. Given it cannot know how it began, but it also cannot know how to end itself either. Demonstrably, it can't, because it still exists, and and it's implied that it wants to not exist. There's one thing it can't do, and there's one thing it can't know. And even admits at one point that, quote, it cannot be done. To which Murray just says, "Oh, I've got all of eternity to think of a way of destroying you then." So clearly this God is also not omnipotent, as it lacks an ability available to all its thralls. So it's not that they can't destroy themselves, it's that it won't allow that status to be permanent, so it will always bring them back. It's kind of a maliciousness going on there. So it can reverse it, but it can't perform it on itself, self-destruction, or rendering itself non-existent. Reading the story, it's fairly obvious that the god has and is having similar conversations with other defiant minds, and implies that many others attempt self-destruction and are simply resurrected by it to aid in its own quest for non-existence. The points here then are clearly translatable. Believers may argue that God is not Asimov's voice, and that it has no desire to end itself. The point, however, is that desire is irrelevant here. Even if God did desire its own end, or not, it cannot not exist, as believers over the centuries constantly remind us. So God exists necessarily, and has done forever. God is thus deprived of at least one ability that every other thing it supposedly created has, which is non-existence. There's one thing God can't do that everything else can. So it seems a bit funny how we can call such a thing omnipotent. So can God kill itself then? Well, no, not really, no. And that actually proves that it's not omnipotent or omniscient either, as there is one thing limiting its power, and one thing it cannot really know, even if it wanted to. Even if God could kill itself, this also spells curtains for theists, as how can an entity that could not exist be omnipotent? Non-existence is obviously a one-way trick, so God may have the power to end itself, but then it cancels out its own omnipotence, as a non-existent thing can't be omnipotent. That makes no sense either. So either possibility screams out that an omnipotent God is highly counterintuitive. It just makes no sense, at least in respect to omnipotence, a key trait commonly applied to God. God then just doesn't exist. Doesn't make any sense. So thanks for your kind attention again. I really do like making these videos. If you have any answers or objections, then by all means write them in the comments. I welcome constructive criticism, and I shall see you in the next one. This is Adam, once again, signing out.